Newton Free Library, March 6, 1981.
91.
1991, interviewing Nancy Quint Schon, a longtime resident of Newton. Now, where were you born?
Well, I was born at the Faulkner Hospital, but my family was living at 64 Ridge Avenue in Newton Center, and that's where I spent all my now 62 years, or I didn't spend them all there, but that's where I started, in Newton Center.
And your father had a business which was?
My father had a business. It was called Harry Quint Florist, and I don't know the dates, but he bought the business from the Fuchs family. And although he was a Boston merchant on the corner of Newbury and Dartmouth Street for 50 years, he bought these greenhouses, I would say in the 30s, late 30s, from the Fuchs family. And the business is still running.
And they were located, the greenhouses, where?
The greenhouses are on Center Street in Newton Highlands and still exist, and my brother is running the greenhouses now.
Under the name of?
Under the name of Harry Quint.
My goodness, that's quite a while.
A long time.
Yeah.
And I worked there, actually, as a child growing up, so I got to know all the people who used to come in to buy flowers.
This is wonderful that there's a tradition of florists in Newton. You worked in the Newton end, or was it the downtown Boston end?
Oh, well, I worked in both ends. From the time I was 3 years old, I used to work. As soon as I could hit the counter, my father had me unroll newspapers. In those days, there were no heaters in the cars or the trucks that were delivering. And so at Christmas time, particularly when it was cold, we used to have to wrap all the plants in newspapers. And so he would buy old newspapers from the dealers, and somebody had to unroll and unfold those newspapers. And we unfolded them, and then we made them into jelly rolls. And when I was 5 years old, I was doing that, my brother and I, and then I graduated to making boxes, because you had to really wrap all these flowers and package them well or they would freeze.
It's interesting, nowadays everybody understands the idea of a family business, but were there many other children in the family, or just you and your brother?
Well, I have a sister, and she was she was older, so she waited on trade, as it was called then. And my mother used to answer the telephone. I can still see her with her bun, because women wore buns in those days, and she had long black hair. And there was always a pencil sticking out of her bun. I'd like to just add that when we wrapped the poinsettias, we had to wrap them. Each flower had to be wrapped in cotton, and they were very carefully wrapped, and that was true even of the lilies at Easter time, because we were worried that things would freeze.
I'm just thinking, your reminiscences go back to somewhere near the tail end of the Depression, the late 30s.
I was born in 1928, and so what I'm talking about is, well, say 6, 7 years later, 5, whatever.
It's good that people still had money to buy flowers. One thinks of the Depression in various ways, but Newton still had flowers, a desire to buy home flowers.
I would say so. Christmas was always big, and I suppose if you looked at the figures and the numbers compared to now, it would be very different. But my recollection is that we used to stay up all night for about a week prior to Christmas, preparing and wrapping and sending, and we would make wreaths for Christmas, and my fingers would get bloody from all of the decorations and making these wreaths, which were really hard on the hands. And it was very cold, and it was hard work.
Flowers, yeah.
It was really very hard work. I mean, people think about the flower business as being a beautiful business, which it is, but it's also a business that deals with perishables, and it's also very tough to keep things going.
Did you ever have to go into where the flower exchange used to be in the South End? That's within my recollection,
Yeah,
the old one.
right. No, I never did that. My brother still does that. Well, it's
The
in a
new-
different place.
The brand new
yeah,
one.
but
which
I
is,
never did that. That wasn't. I was really only involved at holiday time and vacation time.
It's probably
And
plenty.
I used to go to all these Christmas parties looking feeling very dirty and not very beautiful like all the other young women. However, it was a wonderful experience, and I'm really glad I had it.
That's wonderful. You probably made sure you noted all the flowers and where they came from.
That's right. That's right.
Wonderful, to have a family maintained business in Newton. You had mentioned before that you recall the 1938 hurricane from a botanical and horticultural point of view. What did it do to the city of trees?
Oh, it was terrible. It was really great devastation everywhere. As a matter of fact, my father was coming home from Boston, and he had an old 1928 Studebaker. And as he described it, we never thought we'd even see him, to tell you the truth. We were all so frightened. But he said he drove home and he doesn't know how he wasn't killed by all the trees that were falling. Mm-hmm. And as he drove from Boston, people were screaming and yelling at him to please pick them up. And he would pick people up and take them as far as he was going and then continue. They'd get off and he'd continue on his way. And he somehow made it. Now, because he was a florist, we had lots of land around our house, but we also lost lots of trees. But our very favorite apple tree fell down. However, we put it back up again, and it lived and it survived. So that was quite wonderful.
Well, green thumbs.
I have a chair, a rocking chair. Mm-hmm. It's interestingly enough, when we lived in Kansas City, somebody had a chair for sale, and they said it was made of New England. It was made of New England wood. And it was made of wood that fell from the 1938 hurricane. So I have a very special rocking chair in our house.
Well, that's wonderful. The greenhouses, did they suffer much from the...
I really don't remember very much about it. All I remember is that we were in the cellar scared to death, and it was a very, very frightening experience. And I was mad because it was to be my birthday party. My birthday was the next day. And so we couldn't go to the usual celebration that we went to. We used to go to a restaurant downtown on Newbury Street called Salmagundy's. And my favorite there was chicken a la king, and I thought that was the greatest. Anyway, I think they're long since out of business, but it was a very well-known restaurant during that period.
It sounds vaguely familiar. Had to have lasted into the 40s.
Oh, yes, easily. And it was run by a bunch of ladies who were very elegant, and I always felt it was a very elegant place to go. It was more of a tea room than it was a real restaurant, as we talk about them today.
So Newton people certainly zipped into Boston, either by car or if you didn't take the car.
Well,
from Newton
at
Center.
At that time, for example, where we lived very close to Center Street, and the bus that's still running from Oak Hill down to Newton Corner, I think, still exists once a hour. Now, when I was commuting, most of the time there was a train, and the train was the way you got into Boston. Not that there weren't buses and streetcars at that time.
But this was the Newton Center?
What is now the T was a train, a regular train, and it ran particularly for commuters. But I went to Boston University, and I commuted by train, and I loved it. So that until, what was it, about 20 years ago, I guess the T was put in. I'm not quite sure.
When the Riverside line co-opted it.
But that's exactly, those tracks are the same tracks that were used for the train at that time. And that was a nice way to travel, actually. But otherwise, we would take a bus, and the bus would go to Cleveland Circle, and then you transfer to a trolley and go into Boston.
Right.
But we never were afraid to do that. As a young teenager, that's how we went to the movies, that's how we went to bowl, and we would take them up until 10, 11, 12 at night. We would take the commuters, the public transportation.
You mentioned elementary school years. Now, people in your area, Newton Center, went to which elementary school?
Well, we went to it was called then, there was a Rice School, a little gray wooden building, and the Mason School. And just prior to when I started, the Mason School went up to the 8th grade.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time I arrived there, it was to the 6th grade, because they had built a junior high school, which was Weeks Junior High, which I think was built in 1928 or 1930. And by the time I finished with the Mason School, 6th grade, I went then on to Weeks Junior High, which was a wonderful, wonderful school. It was my favorite 3 years of my life somehow during that period. But anyway, I went to the Rice School, and the Rice School only had kindergarten and 1st grade. It had 1 2nd grade, and it had what they called a PrePrimary. I can remember Miss Chater was the teacher for PrePrimary, and it was a class that was sort of a bridge for kids who couldn't quite make it, and they would stay perhaps an extra year until they were ready to go on. But kindergarten, and we used to make butter in kindergarten, like all the kids do, I think, today. My grandchildren certainly do. And then it happened, I was in Miss West's class, which was the 1 2nd grade. So I happened to stay there for 3 years. Mm-hmm. For what reason, I don't know. It just happened that way. And then you graduated, and you went across the street to the Mason School. And the Mason School was a great big red brick building with a big yard. And at that time they used to have a lot of gym. There was a large place in the back for gym. So we did a lot of exercising and roller skating and bicycling and all sorts of things. I used to ride my bike. I could ride my bike finally as I got older to school. There were no school buses that I know of. If you were beyond a mile, you went to a different school.
Right.
So that school buses, until you got to high school, were, as far as I know, unknown in Newton.
Right.
It wasn't until the high school years, because then, of course, there was only one high school. When I went to high school, there was only Newton North High School, and that was composed of 3 separate buildings that were connected by tunnels.
Right. Yes, somebody had referred to the tunnels
The
before.
tunnels and all sorts of...
Were they underground
They
tunnels?
were underground tunnels. And, of course, you just love it because there was all this echoing that went on. But you only used the tunnels in the bad weather. They were only for bad weather. Otherwise, you'd go outside. And that was quite an experience.
Now, after you went all through high school, and then you've had a career in art, have you not? Did you go on to further art training?
Well, yes, I was always interested in art, and I always did very well. There was a wonderful teacher in the 3rd grade at the Mason School, Miss Clark, and she was part of the school system until not that long ago. I used to bump into her. But she was very encouraging to me way back then, and I was always interested in art, so it continued.
And you said you went to Boston University after?
Well, I only went to Boston University for 2 years, and then I dropped out, and I wanted to be an artist, and somehow I thought I should be go to college, and somehow it was hard for me to get all that together. So I dropped out when it was hardly fashionable for young women or anybody to drop out. However, I had a very productive dropout year, and I studied art, and I worked as a sort of a lackey in a in a pottery shop to learn about pottery, and I used to mix clay and mix chemicals and do all sorts of things. Anyway, the following year I went to the Boston Museum School. I got a portfolio together, and they accepted me, and that was how my art career really began.
The rest is history.
I guess.
And for people familiar with your work. Now, when you married and raising children, still in Newton, right?
Well, not really.
Yeah.
Not really. After I got married, our first child was born in California about a year later, and we stayed out, and then we came back again. So I've been in and out of Newton.
Mm-hmm. Had your children gone to any Newton public schools?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, our first two children, we lived in Woburn for 5 years, and our first two children went to the Ainger School, and then came back later and went on to Warren.
What type of school was the Ainger? I've heard it referred to in another Woburn interview.
It was a wonderful, wonderful school. The first grade teacher, I have to tell this because it was so funny. The first grade teacher that our children had was named Miss Duty, and of course the children just had the best time with that name. Yeah. She was a terrific teacher, but her name was, made everybody, all the kids used to giggle all the time about her name.
TV, Howdy Doody, right,
yeah.
Right. And it's funny, I had heard the Ainger School referred to as being named for a World War I Newton war hero.
Oh, really? I don't know that story.
Yeah, and I have to look that up, and I do believe it was somebody who died in World War I.
But you told me the Rice School was named after
Alexander Rice, who must have been governor of the Commonwealth, I think, probably in the 1860s.
And the Mason School, I don't know who the Mason School was.
Now that's a popular name. That must be some historical background.
But Weeks Junior High was named after Sinclair Weeks, and that's where it got its name.
Right. It must be the publishing family in that group.
Right.
Yeah, I suppose all Newton schools, and we must have it carefully documented somewhere, are after famous... the Oak Hill area you were familiar with from the pre-war because of the greenhouses?
Well, no. We used to ride our bicycles, and if we went, my parents' house was off of Parker Street. It's interesting. I lived on Ridge Road when I lived in Woburn, and I lived on Ridge Avenue as a child growing up. But we would ride our bikes, and that whole area from Route 9, and Route 9, by the way, was then called the Worcester Turnpike.
Right.
And for a long time, when the new Mass Turnpike came on, people didn't know which turnpike you were talking about. And Route 9 was really, that was the way you got to Hartford, where my mother was born. So we used to go on that a lot. Anyway, you might be interested in knowing that my father, when he courted my mother, he was in Boston and she was in Hartford. At that time, you could put a nickel in the trolley, and you could take trolleys all the way from Boston to Hartford, and that's how we used to visit her and courted her. So that's just in the side.
My parents in Western Massachusetts.
Did they do the same thing?
Right. Yeah, they were interurban trolleys. I was in transportation, so I
know
a lot about that.
Well, anyway, before the war, before World War II, and when I say the war, that's what I mean. Mm-hmm. Anyway, this farm was enormous, and it covered all of what we call Oak Hill now. And there was a farm owned by the Hurley family, and I'm sure that's historically documented. Well, one day we heard this airplane, it must have been a Piper Cub or something, circling around, and all of a sudden we heard the motor cut off.
Oh dear.
And this plane landed in the field, and that was the big news, because nobody was killed, fortunately, but that was the big news, and everybody came from all around to see this airplane. And at that time, airplanes, there weren't that many of them, so this was a lot of big news. Anyway, I saw Newton South being built, and the Meadowbrook School, I guess it's now called the Brown School, after our friend Charlie Brown was a very good friend of ours, because my husband's in education as well. Anyway, it was really very interesting to see what happened after World War II when this whole Hurley farm was built into what is now known Oak Hill, I guess Oak Hill Park. I'm not sure what else it's called, but all these little houses went up for the veterans, typical of Levittown, which was a place in New York where my sister lived after the war.
When I first saw it, it looked like a California subdivision to me.
Well, exactly. Yeah, very much so.
Well, after coming down from Newton Center and riding the bus, and all of a sudden, these little California type houses.
But that really changed the complexion demographically of Newton. It brought a lot of new people into Newton. It also brought a lot of veterans into Newton. It brought a large Jewish community into Newton, which had not been there. It changed things a great deal. It made Newton Center, which I remembered as a child and remember now, which was a very sleepy little place. And I knew every merchant, of course, there at that time. And I'd go in, everybody knew me. And I used to spend a lot of time at Skelton's, where Feldmans Bakery is. There was an absolutely marvelous hardware store called Skeletons, and that was there for some time. And Mr. Mosher, who has Mosher's now, his father owned a sort of like a dry goods store, but we used to get our shoes there all the time. And my mother wouldn't take us anyplace else but Mr. Mosher's. And that was a few doors down. I think the Tuxedo Place, or there's another men's clothing store there. Then the 5 and 10 cent store, which is where it is now, is
Woolworths.
Woolworths was well, I guess it was Woolworths then, but it was down near the Rabbit's Foot. It was in that that block. And then there was the Newton Center Market, which then became Sage's, and now is, I don't know what. Nettie Green's has been there, but she's passed away, so you can't talk to her. But some of the people there might have know a great deal. Across from the train station, or the MBTA station, was a place called Hahn's Drugstore. And they had an enormous selection of penny candy. So it was always loaded with children. And we used to go and get our penny candy there. And they were very sweet and very patient with all the little kids that used to come in there.
Well, the volume of trade, yeah.
And then where Mosher's was a place called Morgan's Creamery. And Morgan's, at that time, you could buy an ice cream cone for 4 cents. On special days, and it had a sugar cone, and usually they had this wonderful lemon or pineapple sherbet.
Oh, great.
And across the way, where Garb's is now, there was another drugstore, and that was where all the kids hung out from when we were in high school, in junior high school rather. And we would get chocolate Cokes, and we wanted to make sure that they put chocolate in the Coke. I mean, you just wouldn't have a Coke, you'd have a chocolate Coke or a cherry Coke or something.
Oh, cherry Cokes, I remember. Chocolate Coke must be
it is heaven.
Suburban. Oh my goodness, yeah.
Yeah, it's like dying and going right to heaven.
Oh,
it was
great.
wonderful. So, and then there was Bucksbaum's across where Sage's is now. The whole configuration has changed a great deal.
The buildings seem to be the same.
But the buildings are the same, and very few of them have actually changed in terms of the inside, the interior.
Yeah.
They haven't broken through or anything like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we have our old city directories here, you can trace the locations via street address, and it seems like Newton Center has always been a viable commercial area. It's just in the right place at the right
It's
time.
always been. Of course, where the large parking lot is now, the municipal parking lot, that's where the Mason School was. And that was right.
Okay.
Yeah. And then across the street where the bank is, on the very corner facing the fire station, is where the Rice School is that I spoke of.
Now, the Newton Center Library had been there.
Oh, the Newton Center Library was there, and that was my favorite place to go. But my mother used to say, Nancy, don't take out too many books because you'll never return them and you'll never read them. And of course the Women's Club was there. The Newton Center Women's Club was where this Piccadilly Square is now, and it's very funny for me to go in there because that's very changed.
Was that general community events taking place there, or was it strictly women's club?
It was strictly women's club, and it was very exclusive in my memory, but perhaps if I'd been an adult I would have found it different, but I think it was quite exclusive. And
when do you think that perhaps was no longer used for that and became commercial?
Well, whenever Piccadilly happened, which was maybe, 25 years ago. I'm not sure when that happened, but...
that was in existence in 1972, I know.
Well,
because you'd come to Newton Center and see it right there.
But the library was there, and I hope that the small libraries, the suburban libraries, don't die. I know things are tough, but those were very important times for me anyway as a child, as a place that I could go, a small enough library where I could be known, and in a big library you can get lost. I personally get very intimidated by big buildings of any kind, so I like small, intimate.
Well, they say the network of small neighborhood schools were such a strength in this particular the ones you mentioned in Newton, but the trend is elsewhere. Many people that I've interviewed have talked about, the smallness and the village aspect of various
It's very
institutions being very good. Okay. You've lived now in West Newton for how long?
Well, we came from Washington in 1966, so it's 6 years. And somehow West Newton, I think because of the parking, has changed very, very little since we've lived there. It's a little more commercial, but I think stores have a hard time making it there because of the parking.
That's the West Newton Square.
That's a West Newton Square.
How about living patterns in West Newton residential part? There hasn't been any explosion of building there, or
no, there was never any land to sell there
in the last 25
well
years.
Actually my neighbors sold off a lot, but basically not really very much. It just hasn't changed. The one bad thing about West Newton as a resident is that the public transportation is very difficult, so that we used to have to drive our kids a lot. The closest place is 2 miles to a T, and that, I used to tell them they weren't made of sugar so they wouldn't melt, and they used to walk it a lot. But
it's Woodland?
Either Woodland or Woburn. Each one is 2 miles from where we live.
Right.
So that's sort of a deficit, but not serious. We managed to do it. It's a lovely place to live, though. I love living there. It's beautiful, beautiful area.
I get that impression too as a non-native.
Frankly, it's very nice living there in the summer. There's a little neighborhood club for tennis, and
what's that called?
It's called the Neighborhood Club. It's on Berkeley Street. Actually, when we joined it when we first came, which was very nice because as a child growing up, I still play a lot of tennis, and I used to have to wait in line to play tennis at the Newton playground, Newton Center playground, and I always had to wait for the adults. And now I have a place I can play myself.
There has been, it's told me that there is a insertion over the years of more neighborhood playgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think more in West Newton over 25 years, where they could find the land?
No, there hasn't been any change in that way at all. But the Pierce School has a very large playground, which is available to everybody. But no, I don't think any new land has opened up at all. No.
Yeah, that's Pierce School on
Temple Street. And that's a wonderful school. 2 of my children went there, and they had a very, very fine experience at the Pierce School.
And that was in the 60s?
Yeah.
I've heard other good things about it too.